Cool. Good morning, everybody, and a big welcome to Jodi O'Malley. Jodi, I've got you down here in my notes as a Jesus follower, a federal government health and human services nurse whistleblower, a radio host and podcaster, a speaker and author, and founder of nursesoutloud.com and righteousrn.com. And it's absolutely great to catch up with you this morning. I realized that you're 19 hours behind there in the US and probably 7,000 kilometers away. But despite the distance and the time, we've actually got so much in common, and that's really, really exciting. So welcome to the Nurses Collective podcast this morning. It's great to have you here. And we've been hoping to catch up for a few months now. So we've finally done it. We've worked out the time zones and we've finally got in touch, and it's great to have you here. So a lot been happening.
I'm so excited.
Yeah, and we're really excited to have you. A lot been happening, a lot to talk about. And I was thinking, where do we start? But I think the easiest thing and the best place to start is a nice, gentle start before what was right went wrong and what was wrong went right, and when the world was a different place. Tell us how you became a nurse, what inspired you, and a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, so thank you again. This is really exciting to talk with you. I actually visited New Zealand with my friend. We rented a camper van in 2017, and we just had so much fun. We were there for a couple weeks, not long enough, and we definitely said that we wanted to go back. So hopefully that will happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yes, I loved your country. It was amazing. Not only the beauty, but the people. And yeah. So okay, so a little bit about me. I'd like to start a little bit with when I wanted to become a nurse. So I actually had a child at 16. I was married to someone who was 14 years my senior. That didn't work out for many reasons, primarily being a narcissist and very abusive. But I wound up having my daughter with him as well. So by the age of 20, I had two kids under the age of 3, and I found myself on my own. At that time, I did want to become a nurse, but I was looking into the profession, and uh, they weren't getting paid much. They were getting paid like $10 an hour. And I was bartending in a neighborhood bar for like blue collared workers. And I was making way more money and only working 21 hours a week. So I kind of put that off. And then at the age of 35, I'm 50 now. At the age of 35, I reunited with a childhood friend, and he asked me, "Oh, I thought you'd become a nurse by now." And I said, "Oh my goodness. Yes, I totally forgot about my dream." Right. And I decided to go back to school. But this time, since I had changed careers several times, I became a CNA, a nursing assistant. And I loved it. I knew that this is where I was supposed to be. And I, worked my way up, became a PCT. I actually delivered food trays before that. So I really got a sense of the hospital and everything about it. And I continued to work in a neuro and trauma ICU while I was in nursing school. So I graduated at 39 and went on to get my master's degree. I worked in the ER, ICU, med surge, pre-op, PACU, detox and recovery, pain management, and chemotherapy. And so, to say that I wasn't excited about becoming a nurse, I mean, I just loved everything about it. And I wanted to learn everything I could. So in 2018, I accepted a position with our Health and Human Services. So that's the branch of our government that oversees the FDA, the CDC, and NIH. Basically our outbreak investigation bodies, our scholarly research, and our monitoring of safety for pharmaceuticals, and including biologics and stuff. And I worked at a branch for our Native American community. They've always held a special place in my heart. And so at this assignment that I was at, it was under the Indian Health Services, and we served primarily the Navajo Nation. Okay. So that was in 2018. 2020, in January, I moved to the float pool department. And in this department is where they could send me wherever they needed me for the day. And then COVID hit. Okay. So COVID came on the scene in February, March. I believe that that I was already affected by it. So in the 2019-2020 flu season, which in America runs from October 1st to May 1st, we had a ton of people come in, before they put a name to this,
So October 2020.
No, October 2019.
October 2019. Yeah. So
yeah,
way
October
before.
1st.
Yes.
Right. October 1st, 2019. And it runs until May 1st, basically our flu season here.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of us that were sick, a lot of us with those same symptoms, a little short of breath that we've never had before. But we were caring for people. They were coming into the hospital, and maybe we diagnosed them with bronchitis or pneumonia or viral infection. But we were giving out steroids. We were giving out antibiotics, to prevent secondary infections, those kinds of things. But then when COVID came on the scene, we not only locked down and, in my opinion, went against all known public health policy to lock people down. We don't ever do that, especially quarantining the healthy with the sick. Multi-generational households like the Native Americans, the Navajo Nation, they have a lot of elders in their home with babies. Also, too, on our reservation. And now I worked in Phoenix. Okay. So the Navajo Nation's a little bit farther away, but we have reservations from all over the place. And on a lot of these reservations, they don't have electricity or running water even.
Wow.
Okay. It's what we call a socialist medical system.
Yes.
Right. But what you guys have, really, the government controls your health.
Yes.
That's what they do for the Native Americans. And immediately when I started working there, I just started noticing that there were a lot of things that we did there that we never did on the private sector. The only people that really are involved in this socialist health system are the people on Medicaid, which that's our government assistance program, and the Native Americans. And so by the time they came on the scene and said, there's this virus, stay home 2 weeks to slow the spread. And we weren't seeing people dropping dead on the street, right? Like, to me, that was such a grave injustice. It was a medical overreach. It was a violation of all known science and medical ethics. Okay. Everybody. And I would like to get into what our code of ethics as nurses say here when we have time a little bit later, but it all violated that. And
so at that time, what was the fear like in the population, Jodi? What were the messages from the government? How was that? What was the fear perpetuated by that?
Well, it was a 24/7 death toll ticker on every computer, every TV monitor, every news station was talking about all the deaths that were occurring in Washington or New York City. Because the rest of the country, we were dead. Nobody was coming into the hospital. Their messaging was stay home. Do not go to the hospital unless you're turning blue. Okay.
Really?
Unless you're short of breath, then stay home.
Mm.
And to me, I was like, oh my goodness. And a lot of us felt that way. We're like,
Mm.
what are we doing? This
Mm.
isn't how we treat people. We never in the history of medicine said, wait till your body is so overwhelmed with inflammation to come in and seek help. We always
Mm.
want to catch things early in healthcare, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
So then we stopped doing any diagnostic procedures. Okay. So no surgeries were happening
Yeah.
unless they were life threatening, unless
Mm.
people were actively having a heart attack, actively having a stroke. Everyone else, that ceased. So no colonoscopies, no treatment for cancers, no biopsies,
Mm.
none of that happened. Okay. And we had a couple of groups that did speak out. There was American frontline doctors that went to Washington, D.C., where our nation's capital is, and said, this isn't what we're going to do. We are going to treat people with off-label medications like we always have,
Yes.
always have. Maybe you guys would know, like sometimes you give Benadryl to help somebody sleep, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So,
Yeah.
so then there was a brave doctor called Dr. Zev Zelenko,
Yeah.
and you know him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, hero doctor. He came out and he started a protocol, which included vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc.
Go
Uh,
figure.
Go figure. Like I mean, basic, right? Go outside,
Yeah.
open up your windows,
Fresh air,
create fresh air,
good food,
sunshine.
exercise. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Instead, we were encouraging people to order Uber, right?
Yeah.
And get food delivered to them. And I think for myself included, I was like, oh, all right. You know, again, I wasn't political or anything.
Mm.
Remember, I had only been a nurse for 6 years
Mm.
at this time, and I was not political at all. I loved my life. And so when they said that, I didn't realize what a violation of our Constitution is.
Mm.
Okay. And I didn't realize that, but
And
I
I don't
did
think you were
realize.
alone. I really
Yeah.
don't. I think most of us have gone down that journey, other than those very few wide awake nurses for 20 years. It has been
Right.
a slow awakening for many of us. But boy, when we woke up with a bang, because we saw
Yes.
everything then that was wrong about the situation. Jodi, what was the situation with ivermectin in the States at this early period of time?
So we weren't really talking about ivermectin a lot at that time. At that time, it was hydroxychloroquine. And
Okay.
President Trump came out and said he was treated with hydroxychloroquine and some monoclonal antibodies. And he encouraged that.
Mm.
But our nefarious actors, our big pharma people, the people in government that got, they get payouts from big pharma. They weren't having any of that.
Mm.
Instead, what they introduced was a new medication that was not fully FDA approved. It was under emergency use authorization, which the definition of that is the FDA can approve an EUA drug if there are not adequate available alternatives. They don't even need to be safe. Okay.
Is there a limit on the
So,
number of people that it could be used for, or was it for everybody? Because a lot of
so
EUAs are limited in number, aren't they? But this one wasn't. It was for everybody, the whole population.
the remdesivir, you mean?
Yes.
Well, that's interesting because every hospital system did it a little bit differently.
Mm.
There's a nurse whistleblower out of Houston, Texas. She worked for Houston Methodist, and her name is Jennifer Bridges. She said that they just basically came one day and said, here's this drug. Didn't really give any education on it, but you're going to use it. Now, at my hospital, we had to complete a learning module for it. And that said, we had criteria. A patient needed to be less than 92% on room air oxygenation before they qualified for it. Okay. And then you had to run daily labs because this medication was known to affect the kidneys and the liver.
Mm.
So we had to monitor that. So in my hospital system, everybody that was less than 92% on room air in 2020 and a little bit of 2021, we administered that drug. Yes. But ivermectin, really, I didn't learn about ivermectin until October of 2020. And how I found out about that was one of my docs told me about a doctor that was prescribing this protocol, the Zelenko protocol or the FLCCC protocol.
Mm.
If people want to look them up, that's flccc.net. And so I talked to this doctor and I said, I'd like to get it. And they're like, sure, you're a frontline worker. They put in the order and pharmacy blocked it. Our Walgreens, they blocked it and they wouldn't prescribe it. So I had to find what we call, oh my goodness, I just lost my train of thought. A compounding pharmacy. Okay. That's like outside of the system, if you will, outside of a Walgreens type thing. And they prescribed it to me. Now, at that time, any family or friends, because I had done my research, any family or friends that called me and said, I'm tested positive or I'm symptomatic, I gave this doctor's number. And I started getting so many stories, like dozens of stories, hundreds of secondhand stories of people that word of mouth started to spread. In other words, Deborah, right? That this was working, and people who, needed to go to the hospital, all of a sudden within hours, they were turning around and they didn't need to go. So people were getting treated for it. And I started speaking out. I was telling my coworkers, like, hey, there's these drugs and they're safe. Look up the safety profile. It's safer than Tylenol, right? And so I was speaking out. But yeah, I'll leave it at that so you can ask another question.
So what happened next after you realized things weren't as they seemed?
So in December of 2020, because I was a federal worker, we were able to get the vaccine, the COVID shot. I don't even call it a vaccine, the COVID injection, if we wanted it. Okay. And I would say there was probably in our country, roughly about 15 to 20% of our healthcare workers, which total almost 10 million. Okay. Doctors and nurses. Nurses are about 5 million here, just to give you perspective. And only about 20% wanted it. Okay. But interestingly enough, those of us that are in the hospital that were caring for the COVID patients, we didn't want it. The vast majority of us did not want it. So in April of 20, because we had worked with it. We already knew what our risks were. We knew that, if we did get it, that we built up antibodies, right? Natural immunity. And if we never did get it, get sick, that was because our immune system handled it and we never had any symptoms of the body trying to fight something. You know what I mean? So there was a lot of us that just didn't want it. We already knew what our risks were because we had been working with these patients, for over a year at that point. And so then in April of 2020, President Biden and the administration, in my opinion, were like, wait a second, these people aren't running out to get this. We are going to have to start mandating them to get it. And then the talk became of mandates. And so from my summation, I believe that probably another 30% got the shot because they knew that the mandate may be coming down and they just didn't want to argue it or fight it. Or a big reason, Deborah, was it depended on what state you live in, because we have like conservative and liberal states. The liberal states are basically, California, New York, Chicago, Dallas. Those were like kind of our big liberal states. And in those areas, they were really harsh. They were on lockdowns for, months. Some children didn't get educated in person for almost 2 years. So every state in the United States handled it a little bit differently. Now I'm in Arizona, and that's what we call more of a conservative state. And our lockdown by June of 2020, we were free. We didn't have to show cards to get into restaurants. We could just move about freely. And so a lot of people from, like, say, California moved here because they wanted to be free. A lot of people in New York and Chicago moved to either Arizona or Florida because they were free. And so that was a big deal, that we do have that. We have the United States Constitution, but the states, people can vote on what they want per state. That's different. So our governors handled it a little bit differently.
So just to summarize, so you say this 5 million people, 5 million nurses, which is about the population of the total population of New Zealand, which is interesting. And how many percentage wise took the vaccine or didn't take the vaccine in 2021? What were the numbers like then?
Well, we can't really trust the numbers because a lot of them, well, I wouldn't say a lot. I don't know exactly. I have a lot of people reaching out to me that tell me that they just got fake cards, they just complied. But then you had a lot of nurses that, ethically speaking, they weren't going to do that. They weren't going to show a fake card. They figured it out. They went to another system or they retired. And we had a nursing shortage to begin with. And so we couldn't really afford to lose them. And that, to me, got me critically thinking as well. For basically 20 years, we're saying that we're in a nursing shortage, right? But you could risk losing your most experienced nurses, like,
during a pandemic.
What are you trying to do during a pandemic? Like, what are you doing here? So, I mean, let's be honest. I don't know what you guys had to show, but all we had to show was a picture of a card, because what happens if you lose your card? Right? Yes. They're not going to make you go out and get injected again, So it was really easy, honestly. I've seen these cards. They look really real. People were taking, yes, they were taking pictures, we all have seen the pictures of people posting with their vaccine card. So they were taking the lot numbers, the date, the location, off of that and just putting their name, I
think obviously New Zealanders might be a little bit, perhaps a little bit too legalistic, because I did hear some stories of that happening, but it certainly wasn't a commonplace thing. And I would never have thought to actually copy somebody's vaccination record. I think perhaps, because they could be easily traced to where the vaccine was given. And if you're in one island and it was given in another island and we couldn't travel, I think there would be some limitations on what you could pretend you'd had. But so we know that globally, from research that we've looked into, about 25% of nurses question the vaccine and refuse to take it. This is across multiple studies. Would you say that was a similar number in the US, or is it, is it made difficult because, like you say, you can actually, different states, different measurements? Is it too difficult to actually?
No, I would probably agree with that there was about 25% of nurses that just refused to take it. Yeah, maybe. Well, refused or got a card. You
Oh
know,
yeah,
I,
yeah,
I
yeah.
think,
Found
I
a way
think a
around it.
lot of,
Yeah.
right, found a way around it. I think there's a lot of people that, um, you know, I mean, when you put somebody up against the wall and you're like, either you
Yeah.
take this or you lose your livelihood, you lose your insurance, you
Yeah.
know, maybe you're the breadwinner in the family, you know, what are they supposed to do? You know, how do you act ethically in a system that's unethical?
Yeah.
Why are you trying to play on the same playing field? Because it's not the same,
And
you
that's
know?
become very clear over time, hasn't it? So in you'll have to excuse my lack of knowledge about how things work in the US. Despite the fact
Mm-hmm.
my husband was born in Vermont, I have absolutely no understanding of how things work. But is there a central nursing regulatory body, or again, is that state dependent?
State dependent. Every nurse has a nursing board. So here it's the Arizona State Nursing Board. But there is something called the National Council of the State Board of Nursing. And we can get into that a little bit after, we talk about the what I blew the whistle on.
And just very quickly in that regard, did were any of the regulatory bodies involved, or did they have anything to say about what was happening? Did they stand up and protect nurses that didn't want to be vaccinated? Did any of the nursing unions step in and
No,
stand in the gap? Nothing at all.
none of them, and not in any single state, and certainly not nationally. We have the American Nurses Association. They were all promoting this unethical behavior,
Okay.
completely unethical, but they were saying that it's to protect people, and we knew immediately that the shots were not immunizing people, right? We knew immediately that, a lot of these nurses that got the shot, they either suffered some vaccine injury or they got COVID again and
Mm,
again and again.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
And so, even critically thinking, that's another reason why I think a lot of nurses held out and said, no, man, this isn't working. And so that's when our government, at the our leadership, Biden administration, that's when in September, October was when they said, okay, guys, we're not playing anymore. Either you take the shot, get your religious exemption, or medical exemption if your state allowed it, right? Because again, every state is different. So, for example, in California, they do not allow for conscientious or personal objections. They do not allow for religious exemptions. And they target doctors who give out medical exemptions. So those are very few and far between. So
Mm,
a lot of the people there, they homeschool their kids. So they're not in the system,
mm.
right? Here in Arizona, we have all three. You could just check a box and say, I just don't want it. And we're done. You know what I mean?
Mm.
So we
So,
we
so did
also have
people move?
medical.
So you saying that people could move from California to Arizona and not be expected to have the vaccine or whatever medical
Yes.
procedure? Okay, okay. So that's interesting, especially compared with New Zealand, where it was one rule across. No religious exemptions, very very few medical exemptions. I think probably a handful, and that was across the whole population. And even then, nurses or people that had allergies to vaccine constituents were told to report to ED and have the vaccine in ED so they could be resuscitated. And blow me
Yeah.
down, they did. They complied, they went to ED and they had the vaccine. And a few of them, like you've obviously experienced, a few of them still went on to be sacked because they could no longer work and have the second vaccine. So anyway, so obviously the government wasn't doing anything to protect nurses or patients. So that
Mm-hmm.
led to a few very strong, independent, wise nurses standing up and being counted. And you're amongst that number. And
Mm-hmm.
from then grew Project Veritas. So can you tell us what happened there and
Yes.
what led you to it?
Before I get to that, I want to share one story of a nurse that I personally work with now. And when they met me and they know that I was a whistleblower, and talking about the suppression of vaccine injuries and not reporting to our vaccine adverse event reporting system, which is called VAERS, she told me of her story. So I'd like to briefly share that. She got the shot. She left and went to a car dealership because she was getting her car worked on. She literally got the shot, left. 20 minutes later, she feels her throat closing up on her. Okay. She rushes back to the emergency room because, we're nurses. Why call 911? We can make it there, right? She gets to the ER and they had to intubate her. Okay. She was intubated for a full day. And then when she came off, they're like, what happened? And she goes, I just got that vaccine. And they said, oh, it can't possibly be that. So that's how it was in the United States, and I think across the world.
Absolutely.
Because it was the propaganda messaging, safe and effective, right? And so that was a huge problem. So even this nurse who knew that it was the vaccine and has since had some health issues from it, she knows, and so many others know, but they were gaslit. And that was a big problem, because if you don't notice inflammation, systemic inflammation immediately, a lot of these vaccine injuries could have been prevented had we known it. Right. But we didn't. And so part of my whistleblowing was that we were not reporting to VAERS. Here we have this experimental injection across the world. Okay. But as nurses and doctors, it was our role to gather the data, to recognize possible safety signals. It wasn't our job to determine causation, but it's certainly our job to determine if this is a safety signal. And in my hospital, I had tried to advocate for them to put that on the triage note. When somebody checked in, all they needed to ask was, are you vaccinated?
Absolutely.
If so, when? Yeah. That was it, Deborah. Yeah. But they refused to do that. And so that's how I knew they didn't care. They didn't care. They just wanted a shot in every arm.
Absolutely. And just listening to you, it just brings back so many memories and so many similarities. We've heard that on numerous occasions that only about 5% of actual vaccine injuries are reported to VAERS. Would that be a fair observation? That it's a very low?
Well, it's even lower than that. So in 2010, Harvard was commissioned to do a study on VAERS. And what they found was less than 1% of VAERS, safety signals were reported, less than 1%. Now, fast forward to the COVID injection, and we're still using this antiquated system, which the government actually had commissioned in 2015 to update, and they just never did. And another thing, but what their answer was to the COVID shot was another system, and the name escapes me now. Oh, V-Safe was what it was called. And it was an app that somebody could download to report their symptoms. Okay. But now here's what they did with that, Deborah. I found out from some clinical trial participants that the V-Safe system, it only had check boxes for our common side effects, like soreness at the injection site, nausea, vomiting, fever, right? If they had, say, heart palpitations, there was no way for them to click a box. Okay. They had to actually handwrite it out. And there is an organization here, which I suggest people look up because they're amazing. It's called I Can Decide, ICANN, or ICAN decide.org. And there's an attorney here, Aaron Siri, that actually FOIA'd, the request to get all of the input fields of what people were experiencing, what they actually wrote out in text, right? Because of course they have to make it difficult, right? Why not? Here we're
Absolutely.
saying that COVID symptoms range from a headache to diarrhea, right? Or muscle aches. Why would they not put every symptom that you could have systemically in there to make it easier? They
Just further
didn't.
gaslighting, further
That's
manipulation.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So you're seeing all this going on around you. You were working in the ER at that time, was that right?
Well, what really alerted me to the systemic corruption and institutionalization of healthcare providers was I was house supervisor. So I ran the hospital about 60% of the time on night shift. I worked primarily. And my coworker who had taken the shot 2 weeks prior, who I found was a patient. And I went to go see her, and she had told me, "Hey, Jodi, I want to try." Well, let's talk about it. She was a patient, but all of her vital signs were normal, okay, on the monitor. But she just told me, "I just feel bad, you
Mm.
know." And she goes, "I want to take that medication that you've been talking about." And I said, "Ivermectin?" And she goes, "Yes, I want to try it." And I printed out the protocol and I gave it to her. And I said, "If you want it, let me know." And she goes, "I want it." So I went to her nurse and I said, "Have you ever heard of ivermectin?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Well, here, look it up," because she wants to try it. And she looked it up. She called me and she goes, "Yeah, she's not contraindicated. So let's try it." And I said, "Okay, perfect." And then I said, "Call the hospitalist and let them know." And so she called me up and she said, the doctor said it was controversial. And so I called the doctor and the nurse into my office and respectfully said to the doctor, "Doc, being controversial is not a reason not to practice medicine. Will you at least look at this body of evidence?" She said, "Yes." They both left my office. The nurse calls me up and said she's going to order it. And I was like, praise God. A little bit later, a few minutes later, she calls me back and says, "Pharmacy blocked it."
Of course they did.
That, Deborah, was the first time that I pulled out my phone and I recorded that conversation.
Yeah.
And that is when the pharmacist told me that she is told not to prescribe it for anything other than lice or scabies unless I don't want to have a job. And I am not going to lose my job over this.
Mm.
And I was like, "Oh my God, this is where we're at."
Mm.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah, exactly. A wow moment, and not in a positive way. Yeah. So
No, so then,
what did that how did that make you feel apart from that wow, what is happening? What thoughts were running through your head? What did you see coming? What did you understand? What was the new awakening? You know, the Bible talks about a glass and we see through a glass dimly, and then suddenly the glass is clean and we can see very clearly what's ahead. What was happening for you at that stage?
well, at that stage was when the Lord whispered, I call it the little whisper that he does, the feeling in your spirit that you can't shake. It's not an audible voice. There is no burning bush, guys, right? He speaks to us in gentle whispers, right? Um, he's the one who told me record this conversation.
Wow.
Okay.
Okay.
So, but if we want to go back in February of 2020, a little personal story, he had told me I was on dating apps at the time. And he said, I was walking to the bathroom, looking at my phone, looking at my swiping left. And he said, get off of here. And I had heard from that voice before in your spirit. And I was like, ooh, okay. So I sign out and then immediately said, no, delete it. You will know who he is when I bring him to you.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, so I deleted it. And then COVID happened. And in October of 2020 was when I looked up to him because I was researching day and night. I was dreaming about all of this stuff. right? I had this discernment come over me in May of 2020, what the handling of COVID was going to do to the souls and the spirit and physical, right? The mind, body, soul of the people in the world. So then in June of 2020, I fell to my knees one day because that pain, of knowing what people were going to experience really came over me. And that at that time was when I got saved again. Because it's a constant
It sometimes
thing.
takes a moment. Yes.
Yes. And I
Yeah.
told the Lord, I said, you know what, Father, basically take this cup for me.
Mm,
But if not, your will be done.
mm.
And so I had the discernment very early on. So when he told me to record, I knew that this was the moment. And over the next 3 shifts, every situation, like what you see in the video, and there's so much more that I have never released before,
Okay.
because there'll be a time and a place, but that all of those experiences, the guy with the myocarditis, the blood clots in children, the nurses saying, I want to expose this, but I'm going to wait till I retire.
Mm,
My supervisor telling me, you work for the government, you have to follow policy and protocol, you can't talk about anything other than what the patients are ordered. I knew that this was evil at the
mm,
highest level. All of our government agencies, the FDA, the CDC, the NIH, HHS, that were supposed to be protecting us was not.
mm,
And that's when I made the decision to reveal this to the world, because at that time, people were already propagandized. And when
mm,
you're propagandized, you don't critically think anymore. You can't logically reason, right? All that you ever were met with from somebody that was in that situation was emotion. They
mm,
could never have an intelligent conversation of discourse and debate, right? And so I knew that my words were not going to matter, that I had to show people.
mm.
And that's why I did what I did. And yeah.
And would you have done anything differently to what you did, or did you get it spot on?
Well, I got that spot on. But what I would have done differently, which was laid on my heart that I ignored because I was in my government job, Deborah. I
Yeah.
was making 6 figures a year. They were paying us $25,000 extra a year for hazard duty pay. I
Whoa.
was caring for the Native Americans, which hold a special place in my heart.
Mm,
I was at leadership.
mm.
I wrote my own schedule. They paid me also $20,000 a year for my student loans.
Wow.
So, but what I would have done differently is I would have started a podcast and I would have just remained anonymous.
All right.
That's what I wish I would have done. I wish I would have came home and spoke the truth and just remained anonymous until the time was right.
Mm.
That's what I wish I would have done differently.
To avoid some of the criticism that you've had, or
No, no, no. I would have went when I say been anonymous, I meant I would have remained anonymous in 2020,
right.
right? Just to get, to see how many other people would reach
Yeah.
out and all of that, and that I could share what I was seeing on a daily
Mm,
and, hopefully wake people up. But the choice, I didn't cover my name. Or my likeness. My face is on there, and so are the other people that were involved.
mm,
And they had asked me, do you want to be in the shadows? And I was like, no, evil hides in the shadows.
mm,
I need to stand out bold with my face and my license, and my credentials there, so people know,
mm.
that what I did was ethically right, and so yeah, no,
Because
I
you're right.
released. Mhm.
That is what has happened, isn't it? You know, we've not really seen the face of the evil that's behind this from a global perspective. We've seen the people in puppet roles that have been delivering the messages in the individual states and countries, but we've never really seen, we suspect we know who it is, but we've never really seen that face of evil. So you've
Right.
almost been that light shining in the darkness, and your face has represented that light. So I can see why you did what you did. And yeah, in hindsight, maybe there was a different way to do this, but you didn't.
Mm-hmm.
You spoke out, you went public. What was the initial reaction to from nurses, particularly with regard to the messages that you were putting out there? What was said and what did you hear?
After I blew the whistle,
Mm,
oh my gosh, 99.9% positive feedback.
mm,
You know, I didn't know how the world was going to react because remember, you know, the narrative at the time was, you know, you do this for mankind,
mm.
right? But 99% of love is what I received. People were hungry. They were starving for the truth. They were waiting for somebody to come out and tell it exactly how it was. And that's why I had the video the way I did, and I didn't hide behind it.
And that's one reason why it was probably not wrong for you to do it the way you did. I know you might think, you know, perhaps I could have just presented it differently, but obviously getting that kind of response is a really good indicator that you were on the right lines and you
Yeah.
had heard that prompt. So that's really good. So what was the professional cost for you? In New Zealand, we've had a few very brave doctors and nurses speak out. And even to date, even as this week, and I know it's almost 4 years since you spoke out, or just over 4 years since you spoke out, but even 4 years on in New Zealand, this week, one of our doctors has been fined 54,000 New Zealand dollars for speaking out. So she wasn't even practicing at the time. In fact, she hadn't practiced for probably 19, 20 years, but she was still um, regulated by her regulatory body and fined monetary wise. We've got nurses that spoke out that are continuing to, and midwives that are continuing to be penalised professionally and personally for having the courage to speak out. So, what has been the reaction, or what has been the result professionally for you?
Well, professionally speaking, I received 18 board complaints to the nursing board, and they ordered me, hold on, and they ordered me to undergo a formal ethics evaluation to answer each one of those complaints. After I did, the ethics evaluation cleared me of any wrongdoing and
Of
said that
course
I
they did.
acted ethically.
Yeah.
And the board of nurses, I believe there was 12 of them that I had to go in front of. I believe 8 out of 10 sided with me. And so my license is free and clear. I never lost my license, and it just went away after that. The
So what were
investigation
the
handled, and
complaints? What were the actual complaints that you had brought nursing into disrepute or
yeah, they said that I was creating vaccine hesitancy, all of these liberal talking points, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, promoting unsafe drugs, prescribing unsafe drugs, serendipitously recording my colleagues, which I understand. I mean, that is a huge thing for a nurse to do,
mm,
and I do speak out on the importance of, creating a workplace safety.
mm,
Okay. Where I wasn't pulling out my phone because somebody, you know, gave the wrong med, right? Or, I was and recording them,
yeah.
I wasn't doing that. This was a global issue to public health and safety.
Mm.
And so that's why I took that step of, recording on my phone.
There was a need to take drastic action essentially, and you did what you had to do to prove a point.
Absolutely.
So yeah,
Yes. And
okay.
after my exposure came out on social media, a couple months later, the National Council of the State Board came out with a paper, a policy on how they were going to handle nurses like me. Right.
Ah,
They're like, if you speak out on any drug that, that's not CDC or FDA approved, and you're promoting misinformation and disinformation, you're going to lose your license. And I was like, who do they think they are?
mm,
And
mm,
to me, it was just this really this reach of this evil,
mm,
that's like, no, we are nurses, and we have a code of ethics that we follow.
absolutely.
Matter of fact, in any single medical journal, I'd even, encourage your listeners to tell me if I'm wrong. But prior to 2020, misinformation and disinformation has no place in science.
Mm,
So you'll be hard pressed to see those words in any medical education, right? Because
mm,
science is all about debate and discourse and new information and
mm.
challenging the narrative, right? So yeah, they did that, but my board acted ethically, and they basically threw it all out. So after that, I went on to create Nurses Out Loud podcast, where a different nurse host speaks daily. We've been doing that Monday through Friday for almost 3 years now. And people ask, like, how are you guys able to speak? And I say, well, we're able to have courage because we are all faith based. We
Mm,
know that this world isn't our home. We know that our time here on earth is very short in comparison to eternity. And we know that we are going to have to answer to our creator, right? When Jesus asked you, like, hey, why did you go along with this? And I'm going to say, oh, because I was afraid of losing my job. And then
mm,
he's going to say, like, really? You didn't trust me?
mm. Absolutely. And it is that underpinning, at the end of the story that kind of drives us. And I am interested as well in the differences that I'm hearing about, particularly your state in the US, as opposed to what's happening with the global overreach and the bureaucracy over here,
Mhm.
where in we weren't and we still aren't allowed to, we're told what to say, told what we couldn't say. So we weren't allowed to talk about any alternative treatments, and we had to toe the line in with regards to the vaccine narrative. So
Mhm.
it has been really hard, and there are some small changes now. Things are just because we're so distanced from the event, but obviously the real issue is what's coming next. What have we got to prepare ourselves for next? And because something will come, something will happen.
Oh,
So
yeah. I think it was a test for
it was
sure.
absolutely a test. And those nurses that, fell at this stage, will they be braver next time? Those nurses that stood up this time, will they have the courage and strength? Because, it hasn't gone away. It is still there. We're still battling daily. Even the
Mhm.
nurses that went back into the system, they don't feel that they fit in anymore. They feel that this is not their home. That they're seeing things around them and things that they didn't see before, and now coming to light. The use of other
Yeah.
drugs and treatments, and just this over riding overreach of regulatory bodies, the lack of help and the lack of support. It's incredible, and there's just this
Yeah.
sense of we're on a precipice here. And it's probably worldwide, but in New Zealand, we're definitely feeling it.
Okay.
And it's like the unknown abyss that we're kind of walking into. So, which is where people like yourself and me that have that faith, we just bolt into that and just wrap ourselves in God's love, and and for his wisdom and understanding and compassion towards those around us. So
Right.
that's a beautiful sense of wellness that comes with walking in the spirit. But
Mhm.
what would your message be to nurses that know that they were conned, that have been vaccine injured, or put it behind them now, move on, it's over and done with? What would your message be to those nurses that are in the system, that are seeing the results of what happened in 2021 for us here?
Well, my message is to take, to look at you. I mean, look at what you've done, Deborah. I mean, this is amazing. Your courage and your bravery and your light shining out in that darkness to reach out to you and to figure out what can you guys do. Now, here in America, we are looking to go back to the bedside, to go back to people's homes, to go back to like what nursing used to be.
Yeah.
Caring for the whole person, mind, body, and spirit. Yeah. I don't know what your regulations are or not, but start your own business. Go into those people's homes, look in their refrigerator, talk with them, figure out what's stressing them out, figure out what their diet is, figure out, like maybe how you can help introduce supplements to them, like encouraging like vitamin D or vitamin C, work with that doctor that is ethical. Those doctors, collaborate with them. See what you can do on a cash basis, something that can sustain you and provide help to the communities. Maybe create non-for-profits where people can donate to you guys, and then you can take that money and I don't know if you have non-for-profits there. I'm sure you do.
We do, yeah.
But tax-free income, and say, you know what, we're going to be a team of nurses that are going to go into our communities. We are going to help these people. That is what we need to do. See, COVID was meant to divide us. They did it here with the race baiting, our George Floyd, who they upheld him as a hero, and he was a drug addict, felon, abuser, been arrested multiple times. I couldn't believe those things that were happening. And then they tried to separate us between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. The nursing culture on the unit changed, and people were talking about not treating people if they're based on their vaccine status. And we went along with that, because there was only maybe a couple of us speaking out or a bunch of us mumbling under our breaths. That's not now. The time to do that is no longer. And I think what I see with the death of Charlie Kirk, what the enemy uses for bad, God will use for good. And to me, for the very first time, okay, I have seen nurses speaking up. Nurses, I'm getting emails coming in of people saying this happened and I can't believe the nurse said this. We had one nurse manager collaborate with the ER tech to put out a hit list. So the day Charlie Kirk died, they created a hit list of the nurses that were supporting him. Who knows what they were going to do with it? But we had nurses speak out. We had another nurse that went viral. You can check it out on my social media accounts. But I interviewed her. I shared her story. I think I got like 500,000 views. This nurse walked up to a conversation and heard this man say, "Oh, well, yeah, he deserved to die." And she looked down at his badge and it said doctor. And she goes, "You're a doctor and you're wishing death on people?" And that's all she said. She was so distraught. She went to her nurse manager's office, and the manager couldn't believe it. She actually called the doctor and reprimanded him. But what she did was go to her social media, and that's how I found her. And she was on all of our big news stations, right? And so she got her job back. But that's because she was vocal, and courage inspires courage.
Yes.
We have got to look. I'm sure you guys have a code of ethics, right?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, look at that. I teach on it here. If you go to righteousrn.com, I have an ethics course that I created. I'm sure it has to be very similar to, nursing is global. We're the same everywhere. We should all uphold the same values and everything. But now what I did was take those complaints, because I'm suing the government as well. So my whistleblower allegations, I had a 5-day hearing last year. I'm still waiting for the judge to rule, but it's in God's time, not my own. I keep having to remind myself. But I think we're on the brink of something big here.
Mm.
So shine your light, listen to that little whisper. Start getting groups together, communities together. How are you going to help yourself and help people and do what nursing is called to do? Like, we are a noble profession,
Mm.
that we are noble. Hopefully every nurse in this system was called to be a nurse,
Yes.
but don't be institutionalized. The corruption is systemic and it's global. Okay.
Mm.
We know that, we see it. The only difference here in America to the other countries is we have our First Amendment speech protected.
Yeah.
And we also have the right to bear arms. We have the
Mm.
right to bear arms because if our government ever becomes tyrannical, we have a duty to overthrow it.
Mm.
Okay. And so that is what keeps us where we're at right now. Because let
Freedom
me
of
tell you,
speech.
man,
Yeah.
and the right to bear arms,
Yeah.
really. You know what I mean?
Which is
So
controversial in New Zealand. We had an incident a few years ago where there was a Christchurch mosque shootings, and from that, the government, the prime minister at the time, she um, quickly enacted a law that removed certain kinds of firearms from New Zealand. So now there's only lesser effective firearms available with licenses and strict regulations. So the
mhm,
firearms question in New Zealand is fraught with difficulty and consternation in some parts, but other parts that are a little bit more liberal believe that it was necessary to prevent tragedies happening again. So it's we don't have that same protection of your constitution, and the same for free speech as well. Free speech here is under massive attack and we do have a
mhm,
union that's doing some really good work, the Free Speech Union, and they've actually stood up for a lot of nurses that have been decimated by their professional bodies and by the Health Disciplinary Tribunal for speaking
yeah,
out and for being that brave nurse. And in fact, the majority of the nurses collective are the nurses that have, just by the fact they were sacked, and like you said,
mhm,
risked losing family, licenses, mortgages, houses, the whole thing. They're
yeah,
the nurses that shown integrity. But our heart has always been to what you've described as, we call it, care closer to home. So, getting the heart back into nursing,
yeah,
raising that standard, returning. I trained in the 80s. It's returning to those things that we know are integral to nurses, being the kind of men and women that we're meant to be, and empowering others to be the best version of themselves by what we do. And Jodi,
mhm,
you have done that. Your inspiration to nurses in America and across the world. Your Nurses Out Loud social media. Obviously, it's gone viral, and that's a god, a divine appointment that you've risen to and you've undertaken your calling there, with all the other challenges you've got of working and raising a family. So we're so blessed to have you. Nursing's blessed to have you, representative of so many battles that we're all facing. But you stood up there and you have had the bravery to do that. And like Charlie Kirk, you might not be inspiring quite as many people as Charlie, but you're inspiring the nurses, the people that in turn will inspire other people that they meet on the wards in the hospitals. So thank you. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for standing up and speaking out. And thank you for sharing a little bit about your journey with us this morning as well. And, we hope that just a few of the words that you said will actually inspire other people to stand in their braveness and to stand up and be counted for whatever comes next. So, Jodi O'Malley, on behalf of the Nurses Collective, thank you for sharing with us. We really appreciate what you've said this morning. And I'm just going